And welcome to week 4 of our class. All right, real quick, let's take a look at what we did last week. Last week we focused on the schedule management knowledge area. And the big things we looked at last week were defining activities, building relationships between activities, such as which one has to come before the next. We put them in a particular order so that it proceeded from start to finish. And then we estimated the duration of those activities in order for us to actually develop a schedule. So that was really what we worked on last week. And then we also talked about the critical path, which is the longest path throughout our project that has no float. So with the understanding of the schedule in mind, let's move on to this week. This week, we're going to take the schedule and we're going to apply costs to it so that we can have a pretty good understanding of what our project is going to cost. So the PMBOK has a pretty standard methodology for looking at each of the knowledge areas, and you've seen it before and you're going to see it here. And it pretty much is shown here. So the first thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to plan how we're going to manage costs. So we're going to plan cost management. That's the same for all of the knowledge areas. So once we kind of understand how we're going to do that, then we take a look at different ways that we can estimate costs. And then we're going to use those estimates to determine our budget. And then once we have our budget and we start actually accomplishing some of the activities that we've set forth in our project plan, we're going to actually see how we're doing and we're going to control costs. So let's take a look at planning cost management, which is kind of the overarching task that we need to look at first. Pretty much you start with your basic documents that we've been working with so far. The project charter is one, as well as your schedule. Okay, and then we're going to think about the different ways that we're going to actually manage our costs. Which methodologies we're going to use to account for costs, how are we going to estimate things, especially if we're part of an organization, what particular ways that they have for accounting and dealing with costs. We need to make sure we understand all of those, and we've documented them in our cost management plan, which is the output of this particular task. So once we've kind of documented how we're going to go about managing costs, we actually get into the business of doing it. And that starts with estimating costs. So last week we built our schedule. We had all of the activities identified. We applied resources to those, or at least we applied durations to those as to how long they were going to take. So now we need to use those to estimate our costs. So the big thing we start with is our schedule, and we look at each activity, and then we have to make an estimate, which is really challenging depending on your skill level and how unique this project is. If it's very similar to projects that your organization or you have done in the past, then you have a good understanding from the past to estimate cost. If it's brand new and it's unknown territory, then estimating costs can sometimes be very challenging, and we're going to look at actually how we go about doing those. But estimating costs is really big, and then we're going to later on see how well we did with our estimates when we actually start monitoring and managing the outcome. So let's look at our estimating methods or estimation methods. There's really a couple different ways. I mentioned before analogous. Analogous is a top-down estimating method where you use a project that is very similar to what you are about to embark upon. So if you are going to build a house and 2 months ago you built a very similar house, you can use the cost information from the house you built 2 months ago to do an estimate of what this particular cost is going to be for this house. There may be some changes, but generally you can make an analogy between what you did before, if it's similar enough, and come up with a fairly good estimate. Then there is the bottom-up estimate. So we built our work breakdown structure, our WBS, and we look at each activity starting at the bottom. And with each activity, we estimate what resources we need to apply to it when it comes to labor, which will be your personnel cost, and material. So if we look at a particular activity and we say it's going to take 16 hours for a person to do this, and we pay that person $15 or $20 an hour, whatever it might be, whatever our cost estimate is for labor, we can determine that how much that particular activity will cost by taking the estimated hours by the likely labor cost. We do that for each activity and then add them all together. And that is your bottom-up estimate. That takes the most amount of time, but it is likely the most accurate because you've looked at every activity. But again, it takes a lot of work to do that. Parametric estimating is a way of looking at a task if it can be simply repeated over and over again. And then you can use what the cost of one part of it is to estimate the total. So for example, if you were building road and it takes a team, your road building team, it takes them, let's say, 5 days, and it costs $50,000 to build 200 meters of road. Well, if we want to build a road that's 1,000 meters, we could just take that and multiply it by 5. Because if we know what one part costs, and each part is very similar, we could just multiply it out and get your estimate. So that works for things that are easily repeatable. And then our last methodology is PERT, which is the Program Evaluation Review Technique. So in this case, what you're looking at is your pessimistic estimate when you're looking at how much it's going to cost and how long it's going to take, the worst case scenario of how long it's going to take and how much it's going to cost. And then you also look at the optimistic estimate. Again, how fast can we get it done and how little is it going to cost? And then somewhere in between is your most likely estimate. And essentially what you're doing is adding all those together and you're weighting the most likely estimate. So you take your pessimistic estimate plus 4 times the most likely estimate plus the optimistic estimate, take that total and divide it by 6. Pretty much what you're going to come out with is the most likely estimate. It might be a little bit to one side or the other, but it's pretty much just a way of formalizing your estimate. And in your the cost management plan that we talked about earlier, you're going to document what estimating method you're going to use, and then you're going to go ahead and apply it. And then once we've estimated a cost for each of our activities, we put them all together and we actually have our budget. And of course, at this time, we haven't started any work yet. So that budget is just what we, based on our assessment and other factors, what we think, or our best estimate of what the project is going to cost. And that is our initial budget. Then, of course, you start actually doing the project activities. You actually start doing the work. So you have to monitor and control costs. You have to allocate the funds that you said you were going to set aside for labor and material. You have to actually start spending those funds. And then you start tracking what you actually spend in terms of labor hours and material costs and relate that to what you estimated, and you see how well you're doing. You could be right on budget if your estimates were very good, or you could be over budget or under budget. It just depends on your estimate and how well things are working out. But you have to understand what your budget was to start with, and then where you are as the project progresses. Because if you're way over budget, you're going to need to go back to the sponsor and let the sponsor know that you're not going to be able to complete the project. And then that's a whole lengthy process of itself to adjust your costs to get more money. But that's pretty much what control costs is. It's just like your household budget. You have money to spend over the course of the month. Same thing with a project. You have to see where you are. Are you on track, behind, or ahead of schedule? Okay, pretty straightforward to discuss and in theory. So you're going to get a chance to do it not this week, but next week. So this week, our assignment for this week is based on our work from week 3. You remember in the beginning of this discussion, we talked about a recap of week 3. Well, we're going to do an assignment that is based on what we did last week. So we're going to build out our project schedule, and we're going to build dependencies in Microsoft Project for Mama's Bakery. Okay, and you can look at pages 36 to 41 of the ITP master document. It has all the details of exactly what you need to do and what the rubric is for grading and so on. So please take a look at that. And as usual, our final thoughts. If you have questions, please email me or post a question on Ask Your Professor. And as always, don't wait to the last minute. It's a lot better to get started early and ask early, and then I can get an answer to you, and you'll be a little more successful. All right, that's it for this week, and we will talk to you next week. Thanks.